for funding of the Hydrogen Power Study Task Force. Just a few logistics before we get started. We are recording the meeting for public record, and we also have an archive of old meetings. So if there's anything we reference that you've missed, happy to send those along. We also, and everything's available at this link here. If possible, please state your name when making comments. We produce official meeting minutes, so that's always super helpful. And it's also great if we want to come back and ask you a couple clarifying questions. Just for a bit of context of what we're going to be covering today. Hello, good morning. We plan to do quick introductions, and then we're going to dive right into the Inflation Reduction Act, which we've talked about a lot and is kind of falls under the category of other federal funding opportunities that we want to explore for Connecticut. We are going to briefly chat about CHIPS and Sciences, and then we're going to talk through some of the initial recommendations, specifically around IIJA and making sure Connecticut's super competitive, and then also for that other category of the other funding opportunities. We're going to save recommendations for the report around the brownfields programs for next time, because I want to make sure I'm super well calibrated with DECD. And then we'll have plenty of time for discussion of your thoughts on these recommendations. I do want to note that we are definitely getting to a point where we want to drill down on these recommendations and make sure we all get our comments and opinions in so that we can make sure everything's reflected and captured in the report. So I welcome you to not hold back, and I think we will have plenty of time to discuss. So before we dive into the content, I would love to do just a quick round of introductions of everybody on the line, also so that we have you have knowledge of who's here for the public record and for any comments you might make. But just to get started, I'm Lily. I'm with the strategy team that's supporting the Connecticut Green Bank to execute the task force. So I will go down the line on teams. I do see a 202 number. I know it takes sometimes a second to unmute on your phone.
Hi, Lily. That's Sophia Browning with Daypenny.
Oh, hey, thanks for joining. Then I see Alex Judd.
Yeah, so from Daypenny. Hey, Lily. Good morning, all. Here, Daypenny's strategy in supporting the Green Bank and the efforts through this task force. So excited for the conversation this morning. Welcome all.
Awesome. Thanks a ton. Brian, you're next on my list. Brian Farnan.
All right. Good morning. It's Brian Farnan, General Counsel for the Connecticut Green Bank.
Thanks for joining. Brian Garcia.
Brian Garcia, President and CEO of the Connecticut Green Bank. Good morning.
I'm going to go to Barbara next. Your last name came up first, so you were out of order on my list. Sorry.
That's quite all right. Barbara Fernandez, University of Connecticut.
Thanks so much for joining. Carrie Lynch. I can definitely come back to you if it takes a moment to unmute. Oh, hi, I can hear you now.
Oh, hi, Carrie Lynch from the Nature Conservancy.
Thanks for joining. Erin Childs.
Good morning, everyone. This is Erin Childs with the Strategy team.
Hey, Jen Gorman.
Good morning. This is Jennifer Gorman, also with Strategy.
Kaya.
Hi, this is Kaya from Strategy.
Got all of our Strategy team here. Carmen.
Good morning, everyone. Carmen Molina Rios with the Department of Economic and Community Development.
Carmen. And Carmen's team is serving as co-chairs on this effort. Lydia.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Lydia Rupert, Research Analyst with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection.
for joining. And Lydia's team is serving as co-chairs as well to this effort and providing feedback, which has been super helpful. Samantha.
Hey, good morning, Sam Danowski, she, her. I'm the state director of Sierra Club's Connecticut chapter.
Thanks, Sam. Sophia.
Good morning
Oh,
again. This is
sorry,
Sophia
thank you.
Browning with Dear Pitney.
Sorry about that. Just remembered you did your phone intro earlier. Tyler. Thanks, Tyler. I see your chat. For the public record, Tyler stated that they're here as a member of the public. Thanks so much. All righty, well, that's fun. We have a nice tight group today, so we can really dig into the content. So like I said, this can be a conversation, and super happy to take feedback throughout. I just wanted to orient you around where we've been and sort of where we're going to go with specifically this working group. So we've had 2 so far. In the first one, we dove into some of the brownfield programs. In the second, we chatted a bit more about the IIJA and opportunities there. In this working group, we're going to talk about IRA and get into some of the recommendations. Next working group, we want to be pretty refined with our recommendations. So taking all the feedback that you shared today, we will hopefully be able to refine those and make sure that it's really transparent what can end up in the report. So just for a bit of context on the timeline and in terms of what all those strategy people you just met on the line, we are handling meeting logistics, so the scheduling and the reporting and the minutes, and we're also helping with research. So if there are certain gaps, we're definitely the people to call them out to. And so if you have any questions regarding the logistics of this task force or of this working group meeting, please don't hesitate to reach out. And just a quick reminder of what this working group is focusing on in terms of the requirements of the special act. We are looking at how we can position Connecticut well to take advantage of competitive incentives and programs in the IIJA. We're also looking at the targeted brownfield programs within Connecticut, which we learned are even greater than this loan program. And then we are also looking at potential other funding sources. So we've defined that as what are the state opportunities and what are the potential other federal opportunities such as the IRA, and really making sure those are spelled out. So today I wanted to share a bit more about the Inflation Reduction Act, and then a bit more about other federal opportunities. But I think the Inflation Reduction Act, which was enacted in August, was really monumental, and it really changed the economics in a lot of different portions of the green hydrogen or of the hydrogen value chain. And so I think it's important that we focus in a little bit on this. I believe when the special act was written, it wouldn't have come out yet. So there was, I think, probably if it were the special act were written today, it probably would have been included, I would imagine. So important to focus in there. So one of the first areas that I wanted to call out is the clean hydrogen production tax credit. So that's a 10-year incentive to facilities that begin production by 2033. It actually increases in credit with lower carbon intensity. So that's meant to incentivize decarbonized pathways and level the playing field for clean technologies. And it's actually defined, recently we heard guidance from the Treasury that it was defined as a life cycle basis, so well to gate. It's also important to note that you can use the renewable production tax credit for renewable energy as well as hydrogen. So you can apply it to potential renewable resources that to develop the hydrogen, and then also for the actual hydrogen production process. Alternatively, you can use the investment tax credit. So you can't use the production and investment tax credit in the same go. This is a one-time payment that offsets the CapEx of clean hydrogen projects. And I can actually go back because I just wanted to share the either or component, but just a couple things to note within the production tax credit. So to obtain the full value of the credit, you need to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. And it's important to note that there's still, the guidance is still anticipated on exactly what that means. And folks have been providing input, but given that this was only enacted in August, there's just some clarification still needed. Are there any questions or things that I missed that folks want to call out on the PTC? Yeah, Brian, I see. Thanks for raising your hand.
Just a question, if you don't meet the prevailing wage or apprenticeship requirements, what does the value of the credit drop to? It goes from 30% to something else, right? Or
It goes. So that would be the 30% is for the investment tax credit, the clean hydrogen production tax credit. Let me look that up really quickly. I can find that for you.
Yeah, you can keep going. We'll just flag it and see if somebody can chat it through.
Flag it.
I believe it's 10%. It'll be a 10% drop, but
10% drop. In terms of the investment tax credit, some things to note here is that it's actually a shorter time frame, and there are additional bonuses that are available from things like meeting domestic content conditions, so sourcing some of your materials from domestic sources, and also from citing your facility within what they're calling an energy community. It's assumed that this will have, environmental justice implications. However, the specific guidance around the energy communities is still underway. And I believe, Brian, you guys submitted comments on that.
Yeah, just a comment. The October meeting that we had at Fuel Cell Energy, when they were giving us a tour, we talked about domestic content, and they feel confident that their fuel cell will meet the domestic content requirement. So just flagging that for folks. Connecticut manufactured fuel cells. We'll ask the same of Doosan when we do the Doosan tour in December.
That's great. That actually leads me to my next area, because that I was specifically speaking about the clean hydrogen production facilities, but there's also, under the same umbrella of Section 48, the expansion of the tax credit to incorporate stationary fuel cells, and then fuel cells for material handling equipment. It also expanded the investment tax credit to incorporate hydrogen storage as a form of energy storage. I think that's really important to note, because if we're looking at all these fabulous end uses we've been talking about across the other working groups, there's going to be a need for some form of local storage. So that there's still guidance underway about what that'll include beyond maybe a storage tank. But I think this will be something to potentially for folks to act on quickly, because the tax credit, as it stands now, is available through the beginning of 2025, so January 2025. After that, it becomes this technology neutral energy investment tax credit. So that wouldn't necessarily be tied to a specific technology, but more based on the carbon intensity. And you'll see that's a much more immediate time frame. It's an extension of an existing tax credit that had actually expired, and it restored it up to its 30% credit quality or amount. Something else that's really exciting. Oh, Brian, go ahead. You
Sorry.
can honestly feel free to chime in. I know you work on this a lot, and no need to raise your hand. I won't be offended.
As we were going through these, I was thinking it might be useful in the final report to try to apply some of these to projects from Connecticut.
Mhm.
Example, a fuel cell
Pull out
project
examples.
in a critical
Yeah.
facility, a hydrogen production facility from Nell Hydrogen, like to give really concrete examples.
Mhm.
We can communicate that effectively to the legislature.
Yeah. I like that a lot. And what I'll do, let's plan next month when we're doing our more refined, finalized recommendations and an outline of the report. I'll pull some of those examples for us to review and make sure that it's representative in the way folks were imagining. So, Sam, go ahead.
I think the only thing I would caution about that is naming specific companies. That feels like that would be problematic coming out of this report.
Right, maybe instead, well, if there's examples of maybe types of projects that it would have applied to previously, would that be concerning or
I think you,
rather than?
to Sam's point, I think we could say this is a project in an energy community that's using a technology with domestic content. You know, we don't have to call the company out, but we just give the parameters of the tax credits to get to the economics of the project. I agree, Sam.
Is there a possibility we're talking about projects, but again, trying to understand the scale, right, and the importance of that type of activity? Is there a way that we can capture some data of the potential too? So when we're telling the story, we're telling the story about the actual projects that have kind of occurred, but the potential in these specific areas. If there's a way to grasp that data, I don't know, but that might be another way to tell the story from a future perspective as well.
Yeah, are you can you expand a bit more on the potential, like how many, may be awarded, or I guess with the tax credit awarded, it's not the right word, but
really
or
just
the
trying to
impact,
determine,
like,
yeah,
okay.
just trying to determine the market, like who would be using
Okay.
this and in the future,
Yeah.
right? If we're highlighting a specific project, but the potential of the future users or the end uses and that kind of stuff.
Right. Okay.
Probably a connection to the uses working group, because I know that supply and demand, I don't know, sources and uses. So that would get to the potential that Carmen's after.
Yeah, but I think it's a
Great.
good idea to make that direct connection. I agree between the uses. So I did.
Lily,
Oh,
it's Sam
yeah, go
again.
ahead.
Can I ask a
course.
question?
Yeah.
You noted earlier that these they can't be used together, right? So I think it would be one question I have about that is, like, who's the recipient of funds for each of these? Which are the ones that the state applies for, and which is are there these tax credits for individual companies, or do they have to come through the state? I don't have a good understanding about that. I know where all these rules are still being made. So curious which ones that this report has a role in kind of proposing some priorities about.
I think in general, and Brian, maybe you should speak to direct pay and transfer here, state projects, private projects, because the tax credits are now in a very supercharged perspective to get to clean energy deployment. So nonprofits, public entities can now receive the value of tax credits. But Brian, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great opportunity for nonprofits, governmental entities so instead of, getting a credit, you're going to literally get a payment like you're being reimbursed back from the ITC. And I expect that to be done electronically. So, for organizations like the Green Bank who are deploying solar and potentially other projects, it's a real big opportunity. But then it's also just a great opportunity for government entities and nonprofits in general to receive the money directly. And we should be getting, guidance coming through Treasury Department on that, hopefully in the next few months.
And just a follow-up, Brian, I guess that raises the question of, is state government going to be competing against nonprofits who don't have, as much power here to apply, and how do we avoid that?
Well, I mean, that whole issue of government competing with the private sector is one that's near and dear as a concern from the Green Bank's heart. I mean, I can go back to the days when Brian Garcia and I were just in the earliest stages of the Green Bank, and remember a bank executive in Connecticut saying, "Hey, I don't need your cheap government money stepping up ahead of my deals." And we worked very hard to make sure they understood that we are a partner with them. Here, the fact is there's no zero-sum game. So I think the pie is unlimited between nonprofits and government entities to take advantage of direct pay. So I don't see that as much of a concern.
The only thing I would add to that, Sam, would be, and forgive me, this is my own bias, is when I think of hydrogen, I think of fuel cells. So I'm not thinking about them separately. But in Connecticut, there are statutory caps on the amount of megawatts of certain technologies that can be deployed in our policies. So naturally, those caps create competitive markets to compete for the lowest amount of incentive required. So I think that it's less to Brian's point, the federal incentives can go to anything in the market, but in Connecticut, we've got our own caps given our clean energy policies.
Yeah.
On the fuel cell side, as opposed to the hydrogen side, we don't have anything on the hydrogen side.
Yeah, to Brian's point, I think that's kind of a unique wrinkle of Connecticut policy, but one that we're on it. And I think from a national perspective with the IRA, it should be less of an issue.
All right, thanks. Oh, appreciate that.
Good question.
Any other thoughts? I also wanted to call out the alternative fuel refueling property credit, which presumably could be used for hydrogen fueling stations for heavy duty transportation, which has been identified as a potential end use in Connecticut. The credit cap was increased from $30,000 to $100,000 for fueling stations. And the other nuance is it can be used potentially more than once in a location. And then there's also benefits to potentially locating them in low-income communities or non-urban areas. So with the intention of making infrastructure accessible, for making infrastructure widely accessible for hydrogen fueling. I also wanted to call out the qualified commercial clean vehicles credit. So this is not thought to be potentially enough to cover really a substantive part of transferring over a heavy duty vehicle. However, it provides credits based on gross vehicle weight. The amount is dependent on sort of the lesser of two, of either the incremental cost of purchasing this zero emissions vehicle over internal combustion, or the lesser of 30% of the cost. I did want to note that there's also a light duty credit available, so like passenger vehicle credit available, but since that has been sort of deprioritized on the end uses, I didn't dive into it in this presentation, but it can be reflected in the final report. And finally, I wanted to call out the Advanced Energy Project Credit, which I think would be really fantastic to look at in Connecticut, given that we have tons of awesome fuel cell and other manufacturing facilities. So this provides up to 30% incentive for qualifying energy products or projects, which aim to either expand, establish, or re-equip manufacturing facilities. So this specifically focuses on projects that manufacture things like fuel cell systems, hydrogen refueling infrastructure systems, light and medium and heavy duty fuel cell EVs, and their components. So I think this is definitely something to watch for Connecticut. And just to note that 40% of these credits are earmarked for projects in energy communities, which we, as discussed, are still becoming exactly defined, but we can imagine may have to do with disadvantaged communities. Go ahead, Brian.
One thing we might ask the fuel cell and hydrogen company on the task force is whether or not they have plans to use this to improve their facilities. Just so we know, I think it's a good thing to know.
Yeah. Yeah, what the plans are there. Go ahead, Carmen.
Good question. On the energy communities, you said that they have not been defined yet, right? Is that what you just said?
That is, to my understanding, there's still an exact definition coming out. I've heard a variety of potential focus areas from, of course, looking at, economic opportunity, areas that could benefit from the economic opportunity, also areas that had sort of been an incumbent oil and gas industry that maybe there's jobs that need repurposing, and also potentially environmental justice and disadvantaged communities.
And what federal agency is going to be responsible for creating the definition for those communities? Is that like a partnership in regards from like energy, or is that Treasury? Like who's defining that?
Well, I know that the Treasury is coming up with a lot of the guidance for the IRA tax credits. Brian, do you know exactly who they may be collaborating with on this energy communities definition?
Brian Farnan?
Sure, it's going to be between the Treasury and the IRS are going to make that determination.
And the IRS. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just to clarify the question earlier, I put it in the chat so everyone knows it's a 30% ITC. If the project's over 1 megawatt, if you don't use the labor requirements, it drops to 6%. That's a 24% drop. So in reality, any project is going to have these labor requirements for any project over 1 megawatt. It's just going to be the new norm.
Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the conversation about energy communities. I think in Connecticut that we should be thinking about, regardless of what the energy community definition is, making sure that there is robust community input. So many communities that are currently hosts of fossil fuel energy are disproportionately burdened by the pollution there, don't necessarily want to host those facilities, and may not want to host new facilities in the future, might not want to be an energy community. So regardless of what the federal definition is in our state, we should ensure that there is community decision-making around what happens moving forward.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because that was also something that we put in our recommendations, was to match up the community benefit agreements requirement with this, and what was established in Connecticut with the level of these facilities. So to make sure that any of the IRA facilities that would be considered for credits would require those the community benefit agreements, so that you would know how the community sees or if they would want these and to be cited there. But yeah, I definitely welcome as part of the report your recommendations. We'll go over a few recommendations we had for increasing community engagement. But if you have anything to add or in terms of how to identify if these communities would want to be energy communities or have this investment in their neighborhoods, definitely welcome those ideas and best practices. Right. So I know this is dense. I will be giving you all of this, so you don't have to read it all on the spot. But I just wanted to note that there is also beyond, I mean, the lion's share of the funding is through these tax credits, but there is also significant funding available similarly to the IIJA and grants and other specifically competitive grants. Some that I want to call out. Interestingly, the Defense Production Act there was expanded to, in theory, increase energy resiliency and domestic supply chains in the U.S. For a lot of clean energy technologies. So that there could be opportunity in Connecticut, given the electrolyzer, and fuel cell potential. I also wanted to call out the Greenhouse Reduction Fund, which Brian shared with me is actually modeled after Connecticut Green Bank. So I want to hear more about that. It's the largest chunk of money available in the IRA, and it will establish a clean energy deployment green bank essentially at the federal level. Brian, do you have anything more to share about that?
Just broadly, so back when the Connecticut Green Bank was founded in July of 2011 through Section 99 of Public Act 1180, we were actually created as a result of a failed federal policy in 2009, the American Clean Energy and Securities Act, also known as ACES, the Waxman-Markey Bill, the Cap and Trade Bill. Within that bill was a provision that received bipartisan support from committee to create a Clean Energy Deployment Administration, which would have been a national climate bank. When that bill did not pass the federal government, the proponent brought it to Connecticut, brought it to Governor Malloy and Commissioner Esty, and that's what led to Section 99 of Public Act 1180, which was the creation of the Connecticut Green Bank. So we're now a decade later. There are green banks in cities, counties, and states across the country. And the EPA wants to support that continued activity, which is to support public entities that mobilize more private investment so that you can increase and accelerate investment in clean energy deployment. And that's what that $27 billion greenhouse gas reduction fund is all about. There's a couple of other details, nuances in there. Happy to go through those if folks want, but we're excited by it. We're going to compete for it and hopefully win a lot of those dollars for Connecticut.
Great. I also just want to note that because we don't know yet the match requirements for some of these areas, but I think it's likely that the grants will have a match requirement. So we will be awaiting guidance there. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to note is the domestic manufacturing conversion grants. So if folks are developing components for fuel cell electric vehicles, could qualify for that. Also wanted to touch on the Chips and Sciences Act. So that passed in late July. So pretty much around the same time as the IRA, and it invests $280 billion to bolster the U.S. semiconductor capacity, R&D, and STEM education. There are two opportunities that we thought would be particularly interesting to watch. And you'll note in this infographic that there's substantial appropriation to the DOE. The two specifically that I want to call out is that hydrogen, sustainable transportation, advanced manufacturing, and industrial emissions reduction are specifically called out as RD&D activities, or some of the 10 technology areas that should be supported through the RD&D money. And so we'll see how that comes to fruition, and definitely want to keep an eye on that. There's also a section called Fission for the Future, which specifically supports research and development and demonstration of nuclear projects, which and it prioritizes the applications of nuclear for hydrogen projects. So just something to keep your eyes on as that comes together. Oh, hi, Brian. I see your hand. Go ahead.
Just relaying a comment from the tour of the Millstone power plant from the last meeting. They did indicate that Secretary Granholm had been by the facility within the last 6 months, and that one of the units, forgive me, I'm not proficient in all the units, there's 3 of them. One of them has been shut down, that they were identifying that unit to potentially down the road have more future advanced micro reactors. So they were thinking about all of this in the context of zero carbon electric production and potentially hydrogen production. So it was cool to go on that tour and to hear that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's helpful to hear these nuggets because I wasn't on the tour, so I like to. I really like hearing that anecdotal feedback. So thank you. All right. Well, we will keep moving. So ultimately, the reason why we are talking about a bunch of these awesome funding opportunities is because we want to fulfill the responsibilities that have been laid out for this working group in 22-8, which we've talked about fairly extensively. I just wanted to chat about the timeline and how this hopefully will all come together. I know my co-chairs had some questions about that and want to make sure that we're have a ton of transparency around, the report process and everything like that. And I'd like to also note that these are not meant to replace the processes for vetting changes to state policy and community engagement and stakeholder engagement that's required to do so. It's meant to surface new ideas and consideration for how we can develop a really robust and responsible clean hydrogen economy in Connecticut. So in terms of the timeline, there is currently, I think you all should have received from Brian the public request for written comments that was sent out to task force, right, Brian? I saw that last week. So that's out now. We welcome you to formally submit written feedback that we can potentially incorporate as stakeholder perspective into the report. We will be reflecting diverse stakeholder perspectives. So even if maybe the recommendation was not your preference, we will have that reflected in the report. We also are hosting a webinar and listening session. So that will serve a similar purpose to gather stakeholder feedback, also to provide sort of a high-level overview of progress to date. We will be sharing our draft recommendations from all work streams at the December task force meeting. Thank you for those links, Jen. And then we'll also be giving the task force an opportunity to review a draft of the report. So we'll keep you posted on the exact timeline for that, but if you have the time, we'd love your perspectives and feedback on that report. And ultimately, the final report will be submitted in January, which is part of the requirement of the legislation. Any questions about the timeline or where we're headed? Questions or comments? Any comments from the strategy team of opportunities for feedback that I may have missed? I know. The final countdown. All right. That's good. So one piece that's come up a few times with different stakeholders and also with Brian and Sarah at the Green Bank is, there is a desire to, even though we want to summarize and come up with recommendations, there's a desire to just have like a big old list as well of what's possible, all of this different research that we've done, and just making sure it's all in one place. So I wanted to get your feedback for this specific report, the right information that you think would be useful for this report. Also, potentially, if you have any feedback on like how information is presented or coupled together, we will provide you with a draft spreadsheet to review. We welcome your feedback. Also, let us know if we've missed anything. So one of them sort of follows the federal funding first and potentially has a place to match it with potential match opportunities at the state level, but is much more detailed and line by line of the federal opportunities. Whereas we also had an idea to potentially do it by the value chain area and look at, critical facilities specifically. What's the existing Connecticut funding? What's the IIJ funding? What's the other federal funding opportunities? So I'm curious if folks have a preference or a vision for how they saw a deliverable come together. And totally fine if you need time also to see an example, reflect on it, and get back to me at another time.
And Lily, just maybe to put a finer point on your question, when you're talking about, hey, what should we do for the final report? I think this is a little bit of what do we think would be most helpful or useful to the legislature and folks who are using this report to have conversations with the legislature about next steps and what to pursue. Is it more helpful to be thinking about the application, the value chain area, or is it more helpful to be thinking about it in terms of what's the way the federal government has been thinking about the pool of money? Lily, is that a fair characterization?
I have a clarifying question about what role the legislature actually plays in the funding area, or is this just meant to help them understand any, what's available within the priority areas that have been identified in the report?
That's a good question. And I welcome the Green Bank's thoughts as well on the positioning of this report. My understanding is it's more of to help understand the opportunities. Oh, go ahead, Lydia. I see your hand.
Yeah, it is to understand, well, this is my take on this. It is to understand the opportunities and also to have an overview if there are any gaps that would need to be filled out of some way. So this is always good to see if there is the necessity of any other legislative approach, maybe. So, but of course, the main goal it is to understand what is out there that can be used from the companies in the state.
So to just ask it, thank you for that, but to ask it another way, will they be required to take budgetary action? Do we know yet? No.
I don't think so on these, no. But so the second item of the 7 is an examination of how to position the state to take advantage of competitive incentives and programs created by the federal IIJA. So in this context, our findings are we've examined all of the provisions in the IIJA. This is the findings. This is the examination of that. A recommendation could be, or a finding could be, that in order for Connecticut to be more competitive, to your point, Samantha, community engagement through the realization of community benefit agreements will make Connecticut more competitive to receive funding through A, B, and C, because that's what they're kind of looking for, right? So it's kind of like, what's the baseline? And then where do we go from the baseline to a recommendation to help Connecticut be more competitive to bring those funds to Connecticut? That's where the subtlety, I think, comes in.
I see your hand.
Yes, I couldn't find the raise hand button.
Don't worry.
I can't find, so I understand that this is an inventory of what is. Where is the identification of gaps? Have we gotten there yet?
So we've worked on sort of some of the state opportunities and kind of the potential matching. We have high level identification of gaps, but it's not down to dollars and cents, given that we don't always know what the match requirement is and what the potential of these state programs are to fund on an individual project basis. But that I think should be at least at a high level reflected in this deliverable, which I want to share with you for feedback. Yeah.
And
well, one of the funding gaps that I've seen and in both in my past life in economic development and definitely here at UConn is the match gap for early stage projects. Now, and those are very difficult to get in this industry, in this area, because almost like bio, they are, works in process that may not pan out. And so a state of Connecticut, a source for a state of Connecticut match for these early stage projects. Definitely a gap that I saw in economic development when I worked there. Definitely I see in academic institutions, because in academic institutions, sometimes it's not only that the schools don't have the funding, is that like schools, even Yale, have funds that are restricted. So it's not that the schools have fungible money that they can use to fund early stage projects. We just don't have the ability to park money that way. So I'm just, if there's going to be a gap identified, I think that's a gap.
If I could maybe interject here, and Lily, actually, I think your previous slide was really helpful. If you wouldn't mind going back. So
Yeah,
if you look at the second table, what Lily and team have identified is saying, hey, for this end use, which is critical facilities, there is some existing Connecticut funding, right? And that's what she's identified in the first column. She's also showing that there's some federal funding opportunities that could be accessed, right? And so one of the things that we were really thinking about as we were approaching this funding topic is the way to make things most affordable for Connecticut to maximize the value is to make sure we can get those federal dollars. And so to your point, in a lot of cases, that requires match funding, right? And so if there are state programs or state resources that can help to provide that match, which I think is what you're saying, that really helps with the competitiveness. And so this is one of those things where there are resources available, and I think it's helpful to hear from our stakeholders here if those funding resources are insufficient or folks are finding that those aren't appropriately able to support some of the research deployment efforts that people want to be pursuing, because that's when we can say, okay, even though there are resources, even though there are programs available, folks are finding it difficult to meet some of the federal match requirements. So this is definitely somewhere when Lily sends out all of the resources that have been put together, where we would really, really love to hear input from everyone. But I hope that helps to be more explicit about how we're thinking about the gaps and where folks may be able to flag places that they feel there are gaps. Okay. Sorry,
me-
Brian, over to
No,
you. Yeah.
let me continue the thought. So where this table is looking at a specific federal policy, IIJA and IRA, it will look at all those sorts of things. Under number 6, recommendations regarding funding sources for developing hydrogen-fueled energy programs and infrastructure, it's broad, right? It's kind of like outside of the federal government. So to your point, Barbara, that maybe there's a gap in the innovation part of this part of the ecosystem in Connecticut. So the question then becomes, could the state invest in early stage pre-commercial alpha beta demonstrations of technology? I think that is a recommendation that should be considered from an economic development perspective.
Yeah, I would just add that I think, to that point further, and I think some of the way that you all have laid it out makes sense in regards to, inventorying the federal perspective, inventorying the state perspective, the gaps, whether that be from a matching dollars or the end use piece of it. I think both of that type of information is important for this report. How we tell it or how we show it may not be in a table, maybe, look a little differently, but to the points that we were making, I think all of those are valid points to be part of this report. And maybe we just think about how do you format the messaging or format that detailed information in the report. So
Definitely. And we would love everyone's feedback. So we'll send it to you.
And just on that point, Carmen, like report, presentations, and then delivery to the legislature. So to your point, they're all very different and they're different communication vehicles. So the messengers to Energy and Technology Committee, we should be thinking about too. So not that we're just going to go and drop a report on their desk, but we would have stakeholders, task force members presenting information to get that perspective out. We should be thinking about that too. It's still a little too early because we're all focused on writing and getting people's thoughts down, but we should be thinking about that in January, February, some hearing of this material.
And as another, and this isn't part of the charter of this group or this task force, but at the end of the day, we're capturing some great information that our stakeholders and our industry partners need to hear. So, we're creating this report for the legislature, but the rich data that's in it, and if we start talking about stakeholders and partnerships and communities, we want to be able to share that information after this and get that valuable perspectives to the stakeholders, particularly the industry partners as well.
Yeah, that's definitely part of one of our recommendations that I want to discuss is like, how do we make this information useful or just information in general about what's out there, the funding sources really useful to potential applicants. So would love ideas there from an educational standpoint where all of you, I know, do a lot of good work. So the first area of what we're asked to provide recommendations on is how to position the state to take advantage of competitive programs within the IIJA. So looking at, I know last month we talked a lot about the competitive grant opportunities and the requirements to potentially be competitive for those. So the IIJA has significant funding opportunities that can be applied to hydrogen deployment, which we talked about last month, so I won't dwell on it too much. But we explored both the ones that were directly called out for hydrogen and then ones that could be potentially applied to hydrogen. So things like low emissions port infrastructure and things of that sort. We found that they pretty much all require significant sources of match funding. I mean, that varies. Some are closer to 20%, especially a lot of those that are targeted towards municipalities and like public entities like transport authorities. However, for things like the hydrogen hubs funding, which represents a big chunk, we are seeing a 50% match requirement. So just a little bit of background.
So maybe
yeah, go
Lily,
ahead.
just like spending
Yeah.
a minute on that, because I think this is really
Sure.
important. There are specific buckets of funding and there are specific opportunities that require much lower match funding, right? So in terms of how $1 from Connecticut can get dollars from the federal government, like there's very different leverage points. And so the lower the number is here, right? Like a 10% match means that there would have to be much less money coming from Connecticut. So just as we think about where it makes sense to prioritize effort, where it makes sense to prioritize dollars, places where you can access more federal dollars on fewer state dollars is a chance to really bring more resources to the state, right? At less expense to local residents. So I think that that's something that we've really been thinking about, and I want to make sure that that's that's showing up for folks. Right. Okay. Sorry, Lily.
No, this is helpful. And I definitely want to chat more about that. So that's sort of part of one of the recommendations I want to socialize. But one of the other things to note is we found some exciting potential areas of funding that could serve in match capacity. I do want to call out that we have been exploring, and we've heard a variety of different viewpoints on whether state tax incentives count as match funding. We don't have a clear answer yet. So I just want to call that out as a place where, and I know we have the Dave Pitney team on the line. If you want to say like one sentence about why there's ambiguity there, it might be helpful for the people, the non-attorneys on the line.
Yeah, hey guys, it's Alex. Yeah, I think with the
Yeah.
tax credits and other incentives, the thing we struggled with, which is just, is it essentially upfront cash, or is it a reduction over time, and is it the requirement to essentially get straight cash to offset specific parts of the project? You know, I have this need on my construction, I get this bucket of funds to pay for that, and there's that one-to-one matchup of cash to services or products. A little bit more ambiguous when you get into things like tax credits that apply with certain benchmarks being met to receive the funds. Same things for other kinds of non-straight grant or loan type of funding opportunities. Not to say it's prohibited. We just are trying to gain, I think, some more information about whether, before we kind of recommend that or go down that road, there is that opportunity with tax credits or other kind of unique funding opportunities.
I just want to call that out. And the reason why we're still leaving them on the list, but not necessarily confident that that's a direct source of match funding. So one of the things that may seem quite obvious, but we do think that Connecticut should leverage and maximize eligible match funding for the IIJA. Oh, bye, Brian. Thank you for joining. And one thing that that Carmen, your good point just now, we need a transparent resource of how these things can be useful to different entities within Connecticut. So what does that look like? There are a couple different potential practices that we can turn to as examples of what that could look like. Certainly welcome all of your good thoughts on effective ways to educate in the community and create useful resources. There is some examples of states that are doing local match programs. Specifically, this one in Colorado is for local government, they did appropriate some match funding that then folks can apply to and is matched up within like their provided resources to match that up to the appropriate sources. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, so if folks after click over to that Colorado example, I think in the context of Connecticut, the way something might work like this is if the legislature set aside money through a future bond issuance, a general obligation bond issuance that provided matching grant funds to a project, that there would programmatically be an application process to ask for the purposes of something that would be specific to this sector. And that if the project were to be awarded, then the state would provide its match through this application process. Then the funds would come from, taxpayers through the state, through the whatever. I think that's what this project would look like. It's a process for projects to in themselves ask for a match so that they could then compete within the federal government. It's crafty.
I see another hand. Okay. The other thing that we called out is we need to have a clear understanding of what could be considered as match funding, specifically around this issue that we just discussed. So I think there will need to be a form of closer legal evaluation into the applicability of funding avenues like state tariffs and the recs that we talked about, Brian, just to make sure that, because Connecticut does have really incredible programs like the ones that we've discussed, how can those be leveraged and can they be? It's not to say they're going to be super useful for market development, but we want to, when it comes down to specifically leveraging IIJA funding, we want to see what we can get to count. Go ahead.
Just another nuance maybe for Alex as you're thinking and working through this. So imagine a project that receives green bank funding up front to finance it in a quote unquote state match or contribution to the project, and then gets paid back over time based on the performance of that project. So, a renewable energy credit coming from a class 1 resource. That might be another way of thinking about it. But we're all big picture for folks on the line, like Connecticut has really good public policies. Not all states have them. So because we have the policy, we should get credit for the match side of that policy. That's kind of the foundation of the argument is don't, count our policy as a part of the match to the extent it can. And that's what we're struggling to wrap our arms around.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we are working the phones of any federal contacts that we have who might be able to provide us, but it is clear that other folks are also having questions and not really fully understanding this portion yet. So we're not finding clear resources online. If anybody does know of a clearer resource on this ambiguous topic, definitely welcome that. If any folks at DEEP have come across anything like that. We also know, well, before I move on from the educational component and guidance for interested applicants, does anyone have any further thoughts or feedback or ideas?
I just have a quick question. I know we highlighted Colorado here, but I know you guys have done a lot of research on other states, right? Now that we've captured some more information about the IIJA and some of the programming, are there other states that are coming to mind in the way that they're approaching the match besides Colorado?
California has done a similar, this is from just a funding perspective, not necessarily the educational perspective, but California also did pass some funding dedicated for match funding, IIJA, and I can find the link for that.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. All right. The other thing that we know to be super important is the Justice 40 component, ensuring that benefits flow down to disadvantaged communities, both from a environmental benefit and also from an economic benefit perspective. And so we know that the DOE also takes Justice 40 very seriously in applications, as well as it being absolutely critical to the success of hydrogen in the state to have widespread alignment and community buy-in if these projects are going to happen. So Justice 40 is an executive order that applies to the IIJA. So just for a bit of good news, I think Connecticut has really strong momentum for community engagement. I'm sure you're all familiar with some of these leading edge programs that are bringing communities into the energy planning and deployment processes. So these are just a few samples. You know, Bridgeport was selected as one of the 24 communities that's going to work with DOE on the Communities LEAP program, which is really exciting. You have SB 999 or the Public Act 2143 that we've talked about that requires community benefits agreements for projects over 2 megawatts. We also have DEEP's Environmental Justice Advisory Council. A few practices that we've seen nationally, and then also a few practices that we've heard from some stakeholders that we've talked to through the task force process. So one that we've seen nationally is to provide funding to increase community engagement through being compensation for being an intervener. I didn't see that there was anything in Connecticut yet on that. Let me know if I missed anything. This improves the ability of affected parties to participate in decision-making because it provides funding to actively intervene. So we see that it's in Minnesota, they have it in California as well. Just something to consider in terms of boosting the engagement and reducing burden of being a part of these processes. Any thoughts there? I can keep running through and then,
Well,
I
might specifically pause on this one just because Samantha, you had flagged this. And so earlier in the conversation, I just really love your thoughts or feedback if you're comfortable sharing any on whether, this is sort of directionally aligned with what you were thinking about in terms of the need for community engagement.
Yeah, I do think what came out of Public Act 2143 is very new and I'm not sure has been tested yet. So I think we want to be flexible and see how that works and how communities feel it's working for them. I think there's a potential to, possibly strengthen it. I think when communities are really making the decisions that there's, a community vote. Oftentimes, like right now, our environmental justice law requires that developers publicize, public meetings for the community and have a couple, but there's no real decision making from the community. So I think just making it as strong as possible and looking for examples in other places where the community really does make the decision, not an elected official, but the community themselves.
Yeah, if you have any of those examples, we'll do some more research, but if you know of anywhere that you've heard of that's doing this really well, certainly we welcome that and would love to include in the report.
Great.
Thank you for calling that out.
And I would just say the other thing that that I'm hearing from you, Samantha, is like, it's not one and done. This is really good, but this doesn't necessarily mean that everything is, sunshine and rainbows. And it's important for us to kind of keep a critical eye on things as we go along and provide opportunity for feedback. So if things aren't working, there's opportunity to course correct.
Barbara, I saw your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that as we look at these community benefit agreements, especially when it concerns the developers, there are things that the state obviously can mandate or that they can put into their policies, but most, I think all, development decisions in Connecticut are done at the local level. They're done by the planning and zoning committees of the towns. And in those decisions, rarely have a community voice. They're either appointees or they're elected to the town planning and zoning. Those are the people who actually make the decisions at the ground level. So we want to include community voices at the where things happen. We're going to have to think through how that's going to happen, because right now they're not there. And structurally, we're not set up as a state for that, because our planning and zonings are voted members. They're political folks, not community organizations.
Brian, did you have something to add on that?
Yeah, just following up Barbara's comment, it's not the ultimate solution, but all the new tax code treatments are going to help guide the market in this direction, meaning, as Brian was noting in that chat for the investment tax credit, in order to receive that 30% in 2024, you're now going to have to meet apprenticeship, workforce development, prevailing wage requirements. And if you don't, then you'll get 6%. So there's an economic incentive for you to do it. Now how we get from here to there, your point, Barbara, process-wise, is the big question we're scratching our mind on. It's like, how can we create an environment in Connecticut that drives all that? And I'm sure Lydia and the team are like digging in and thinking about this. It's one of the hardest questions. But we do have, to Samantha's point on 2143, we do have the foundation of something that can make Connecticut really competitively ahead of the game. If this is aligned, Connecticut's is 2 megawatts, the federal government is 1 megawatt, so if there's some alignment there, Connecticut can be in its own competitive advantage, because the policy structure in Connecticut would be consistent with what the federal government is after. But a lot of work to do between here and there. But we're all feeling it, and we just have to understand it and make the capital move to it when the community wants it. Community benefit agreements.
Adding on to that, I think what we're hearing is, these ideas are potentially great. Maybe Samantha, that's what you're talking about. On paper, sounds really like it could be meaningful. In execution, is it burdensome to communities? Because it takes a lot of time, and what could do, and I think we heard from Adrian, like potential need for funding for technical expertise and compensation for community member time. Those areas I think could be well reflected in this paper or in this report, as just called out as conflict. Go ahead.
From someone who has worked with all 169 towns, our towns do not take to these kinds of new structure. I see you smiling, Carmen, and they don't. And I mean, we had, our federal opportunity zones, right? Was a program that really provided benefits for developers who wanted to use opportunity zones. The state wanted to use opportunity zones, but when it came into putting them in the town, wow. And so that train passed us by because we could not get it from here to there. So we have to think through these structures, and don't forget, these towns are staffed by part-time people who actually have to do this. So we're going to have to make it very easy for them to implement so that it's not a burden.
Do you have any best practices from your experience in working with all of these different towns of ways that you've seen it be made easier on communities to either implement or engage?
The best way is for us to have a regional structure for economic, a regional structure instead of 169 towns. But I'll tell you right now, I'm going to be dead before we get that. You know, I'll be gone. I'll be on the other side before we get that. So
Hope we get it sooner.
I do not have an example for me of
Yeah.
of how that would work. You know, this is all driven by how Connecticut is structured. And so we just have to live with that structure and find creative ways that we can get these great policies onto the implementation stage. But I don't have any examples.
This is really helpful feedback that I do think should definitely be reflected in the report. So thank you for these insights, and I may send you some draft language to look at. All right, well, in the interest of time, we'll keep moving if no other comments. We also wanted to look at the recommendations regarding funding sources for developing hydrogen-fueled energy programs and infrastructure. I think one thing that's important to note, if you attended the recent task force meeting, we discussed the desire to prioritize certain opportunities, and the way that we did that specifically for end uses was against multiple criteria. So there were 8 different elements, and which are listed in those blue boxes. And we also incorporated feedback from different stakeholders throughout. This was in the end uses working group. And we identified which end uses should be really looked at more closely by other working groups. So they've passed those on to us. So the highest priority end uses on the left, the end uses working group said that they have high confidence that it'll be used. Either it's most competitive, or it's potentially maybe the only viable decarbonization option in some cases, or it has really strong environmental and community benefit. The other areas, potentially like in that middle column, are ones with strong financial use case and maybe create social benefit, but are potentially on a smaller scale today. So mostly demonstration scale. And then the areas on the right are certainly viable uses of hydrogen, but the economics are maybe less settled. So we didn't move it into the high priority buckets for now, economics or use case for them versus other decarbonization technologies. So that's just a summary of, as we're moving into potential mechanisms for end uses. I just want to clarify that. So regarding the legislative mandate to make recommendations regarding funding sources for developing hydrogen-fueled energy programs and infrastructure, based on the need for match funding and optimizing the Connecticut dollars, we do think I'm curious your thoughts on that Connecticut should consider allocating or increasing grant or loan funding to enable end uses that have potential sources of federal funding, require low levels of state match funding, and can be deployed in the near term. So high technology readiness to enable a hydrogen ecosystem. So some examples we have of that would be heavy duty trucks, off-road material handling equipment, and port infrastructure equipment. We know that hydrogen fueled shipping might be a little more in the future. However, getting that infrastructure in through port infrastructure would be a good way to potentially work towards that future planning while also having near-term benefit. So we've proposed, or we've shared a few examples of state level programs that could be looked at as practices for Connecticut. And then on the other end of that coin, it's still useful to consider developing additional funding mechanisms that will attract private capital to enable further market development. So some examples of that might be a low carbon fuel standard, clarifying permitting requirements could certainly attract private capital as private match funding. So those are just a few examples of potential mechanisms to take advantage of some of the end uses that we've identified through the end uses working group. So definitely curious if folks have thoughts or questions on these areas and maybe why they've been identified as focus areas, anything like that.
This is Brian. It's not on here, maybe it's implied, but would be something like consideration to increasing certain existing caps on clean energy programs. So for example, the low emission renewable energy solutions program that supports fuel cells. But we could give caveats that focus those facilities in resilience hubs, critical facilities, that they be used in combined heat and power mode to reduce GHGs. So there could be ways of either increasing caps or giving preferences to the current caps to support these policy objectives. Putting more weight towards projects that serve critical facilities, those sorts of things. I don't see that on here. Maybe it's implied. It's kind of a critical facility area.
Yeah, I was thinking about that with the deep microgrid program. Would it make sense to consider what expansion of that would look like to support the match funding? I see Samantha, go ahead.
Yeah, so when to clarify, when you say cap, you mean there's a cap on state subsidies for these things, not a cap on private investment in them. Is that correct?
Like right now, there's a 10 megawatt a year cap. Help me out, Lydia. I may be getting my numbers wrong. A 10 megawatt cap on the low emission renewable energy solutions program. So one could either increase that by 5 megawatts to 15 megawatts a year for certain applications, or one could look at the existing 10 and put certain prioritizations on it. We want to see greater weight for fuel cells being deployed at hospitals, resilience hubs, those sorts of things.
I would just note that right now there is no definition of what clean hydrogen is, and so I think expanding that without having a clean hydrogen definition, and from our perspective, that is through non-fossil fuel feedstocks in order to, as we move into the future, to be reducing the use of fossil fuels. So I think we need to bring everything into the picture here.
That definitely, I agree. It needs to be defined in order. I think that area of the sources working group is going to be very, we'll make sure to tie into our section. That's a really good recommendation. Just taking notes on everyone's good ideas. I know our time has flown by. I want to potentially breeze through a few. Oh, Barbara, do you have a comment before we move forward? Okay. That other point I just wanted to make is that there are significant funding opportunities through the IRA. And that should be really considered and optimized for. One area that we've talked about, Brian, that you mentioned is potentially lowering the threshold under Public Act 2143 to make sure community benefits are considered in alignment with the state and the IRA definition. I just want to nest that here since that's where we're talking about sort of other forms of funding. But I think what could tools look like to support applicants to leverage these resources? So similarly to the IIJA tools, how do we need to communicate and educate about these opportunities? Since a lot of them will probably be pursued by private capital. Go ahead, Brian.
Just a quick point on 2143, that
Yeah.
current only applies to class 1. So hydrogen is not a class 1. So there would have to be some treatment, to your point, Sam, of what's the definition of hydrogen, whatever that is, underneath the just transition policy, it would have to be, hydrogen would have to be included in there in order for that community benefit agreement structure to apply to hydrogen.
Does the sources working group know that? We should sure that they do. I was gonna say, has anyone mentioned it in that working group? I think that's a great point. Let's see, and then Sam, I think I saw your hand, but I'm not sure if it's an old hand. Okay. So I lowered it. Just briefly chatting about next steps. I know we've kind of breezed by things, so I want to make sure that I give folks a chance to look at the links and the resources and potential avenues and provide feedback. So I'll be sending out the deck. I will also be sending out probably sometime next week, although I know folks will be off, that spreadsheet that we talked about that kind of has the gaps identified and the potential match structures. So I think that would be a great next step, is to have people look at that. Let me know if there's any areas missing. I think you all are right in that we need to tell the story well of the gaps analysis and then talk about potential funding sources. So point definitely well taken as we're drafting. We do have one remaining working group meeting on the 15th, but you can expect me to be pretty active with you in between, as this is going to be when things are going to come together. So you can expect emails and opportunities to weigh in that way. Any questions about the timeline or what's next, or anything we didn't talk about today that feels like it's missing or haven't talked about to date? And then just acknowledging the brownfield, of course, recommendations are missing because we're going to talk about that at the next meeting. Well, thank you all for your great recommendations. We have a lot of good stuff to think about. And thank you for coming today. I know it's almost Thanksgiving and folks are ready for vacation. So I appreciate you spending this Friday with me. Is there any other thoughts or announcements before we sign off?
Obviously, you don't work for Vadenka, but because you talk about vacations, we don't.
I do not, but I will be in next week. If you have any needs, I will be around. But thank you all. I appreciate your time and look forward to refining this even further at our final working group.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all. Take care.